Hello everybody. This is Psych 3280, Neural Base of Consciousness, week 5. And this week, I'll be talking about neural correlates of consciousness. So as a recap of week 5, we started arguments about color vision at the periphery. And the first, to just recap, couple of points that these people who believe that color vision at the periphery are all illusory. So their point is, the first one and foremost, that the cone density degrades rapidly of the phobia. And in V1, the phobia is overrepresented at the expense of the periphery. So the V1 has a much smaller portion of the neurons are dedicated for the periphery. And this cortical magnification that at the part implies provision, not only for color, but also at the periphery, okay? On the other hand, what I provided to you as a support for the color vision at the periphery is that from the phenomenological observation, that brief presentation of an unexpected random color patch still induces vivid color experience. This random position and also brief presentation basically makes it impossible for you to move the eyes to the location of the color patch. Also, because it's completely unexpected color patch, you can't use memory or expectation to experience color. Still, we saw that quite a vivid and also structured color experience at the periphery. And also to explain in terms of mechanism, we do have neurons at the periphery that has a bigger receptive field. And so because of their receptive field, they can collect more broader range of the cones and so on. So it can compensate for the lower density of the cones at the periphery. And these kind of a convergence of the far periphery, where you have a larger receptive field at the level of the retinal ganglion cells, converges into one V1 neurons, and many new bunch of the V1 neurons also converges to the next hierarchy, like V2 or V4 and so on. So this convergence effect starts to become accumulating over the hierarchy. And therefore, as long as the surface is uniform, we should expect that, in fact, color experience can be even more vivid at the periphery than the phobia. All right. So that's what I said about the argument in support for the color vision of the periphery. And then towards the end, we also discuss about the neural mechanism underlying blindsight. First thing was that 90% of the visual input from the retina goes through LGN to FE1. And 10%, only 10% goes through the superior colliculus and the polynuclear to the cortex. And the latter can mediate eye movements and the localization in a non-conscious manner in a blind sight. And the latter one also can potentially affect on the attentional focus and movement, which we'll talk about in week 8 and 9. All right, and then along the way, I introduced a very important concepts or features of neurons in the visual system. One is a receptive field and a visual hierarchy. And that was defined through the layer-based connectivity, anatomical connectivity among the areas. And the key idea to explain the peripheral phenomenology was the bigger size of the receptive field as we go into the periphery and also as we go into the higher hierarchy. And then within each area of the brain, I talked about possible columnar organization and also layer structure. The details matters, and also these are slightly different for each of the areas. And I suspect that these difference can explain why each different kind of areas generate different types of the chorea. However, the details will come later or in the future, actually. And then I also mentioned that there exists multiple visual pathways. So hierarchical structure already implies, but the visual processing doesn't go like one by one in a serial manner, but it branches out and then converges and then diverges and so on. And if you start thinking about temporal hierarchy, it's even more complex, but I will not touch about it at the moment. So the learning objectives for week 6 is that first, I'll talk about what are the neural correlates of consciousness, NCC. And then what are the empirical experimental designs and strategies to find the NCC? And then we'll move on to the question of, can the NCC be found in B1, primary visual cortex? And then along the way, I'll demonstrate or introduce the particular experiment, which shows that the neural mechanism within V1 is unlikely to be NCC. And what do you mean by that? Then I'll talk about what are the theoretical implications of the evidence that NCC is not in V1. Then I'll talk about what are the properties of the neurons in the other visual areas other than V1. Can we find NCC in other areas of the visual brain? And then also, using the logic that we used for the V1 NCC experiments, can we also apply that to other areas? And then finally, I'll talk about the particular area of the brain within the visual areas, MT or V5. What are the causal relationship between the neurons in this area and the conscious perception of visual motion? As a reading assignment, Quest for Consciousness, chapter 5, 6, 7, 8 are recommended, but you don't need to read all of them. And one optional but quite important paper, useful paper for your final project is a Friss 1999 paper about NCC. And then because this is the last lecture before that e-assessment in week 7, I'll give you some tips on that in terms of active learning, which is known to be enhancing and useful for your preparation of the exam, enhancing the memory, okay, based on the psychological experiment and also neuroscience. The first thing is that as I have been structured this lecture all the way from lecture 1 to now, I always start with the questions in this learning objectives. So if you can, stop at this stage of this learning objectives and then try to answer all the questions that using your own knowledge at this point, okay? So ideally, this is best done even when you see the video at the first time. But if it's difficult to do, which I imagine to do, you don't need to do it when you watch the video for the first time. But now, I assume that you have already watched the lectures up to week 1 to 5. You can probably do that at least for week 1 to 5. And then if you type in what you already know, then you probably realize that you cannot answer all of these questions in learning objectives. And then watch the videos or check the slides that you feel most unsure about your answer. And that's much better way of focusing the particular area of the of the material that you are not fully understanding. Also, because this way, your attitude to watch or check the slide becomes much more active. Anything that you have written, and then also, your expectation or your understanding was betrayed, also lives in your memory much better. So spend some time on preparing, watching the video or checking the slides before you do that. Otherwise, your learning becomes passive and your memory becomes much less effective. Okay, and then another thing of tip is that doing this with the interval, that's probably better. So let's say if you are doing that for week 1 lecture in today, then just try that, and then 2 days after, try it again. But this time, so this 2-day interval is important. Unless you put on some kind of interval, especially with the sleep or playing and so on, your memory doesn't get stabilized. And then 2 days is nice timing that your initial understanding gets kind of filtered out, and some of the things that you don't really remember well gets almost wiped out. So at this point, if you try to remember that or try to memorize it again, it leaves a memory to your brain very well. But if you do it, much earlier, then because you already remember the knowledge at that point, review doesn't actually work really well. Trying to remember what you used to remember, but you can't remember very well is a very effective way to enhance your memory, okay? That's known in neuroscience and psychology. And then at that time, I recommend you not to start writing because it takes some time and your time is probably limited for preparation of week 7. But I suggest that using, for example, iPhone or something like that that you have, just speak to the device, or maybe speak to the friends. That's actually even better. And speaking also, to explain all these learning objectives to yourself also enhances your multimodal memory by moving your mouth and hearing your own voice and so on. That enhances, first of all, memory. And secondary, it also allows you to realize, which learning objective that you are actually not able to answer. And that, again, you can focally, check the slides and the videos. So the idea is that it's probably best if you can do that. This, speaking to device or speaking to friends as if you're giving a lecture on that material. And if you feel like you can give a lecture on the material, then there's no concern that you're going to lose any points in the e-assessment. And if you do some of them, then most likely that's the kind of the question that nobody can answer. There are some answers like this potentially. Okay, with that, that's the admin part of this week.